What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and we continue our look at the 2022 college football season. The first thing we always do, we look at the schedules. We do schedule previews and then give you a very early projected record for each team. This is not a prediction. Keep that in mind. We're just simply going to give you a projection based off of how tough the schedule is. Oklahoma is up next. Before we get into the 2022 schedule, let's look back at 2021. Here is the schedule from 2021. You can see Nebraska, Tulane, Western Carolina. Those were the non-conference games. Not too tough of a non-conference schedule. Thought that Tulane was going to be better last year. They wound up finishing with a pretty bad record. And then Nebraska, of course, we know they were much better than their record would suggest. That wound up being a really good game. But like I said, Nebraska, I should say, played everyone tough. So, I mean, I don't think you can fault Oklahoma for that game being close. But again, you look at the rest of the schedule. Who do they play on the road in the Big 12? They play Kansas State, Kansas, Baylor, and Oklahoma State on the road. This says at Texas, but of course that game on a neutral field. So they're going to play every year. They'll play 4 home, 4 away, 1 neutral site game in the Big 12. But they wound up having to play both Baylor and Oklahoma State on the road, the two best teams in the Big 12, the two teams that went to the Big 12 championship. Coming into the year, we thought it was going to be Oklahoma and Iowa State, and they had Iowa State at home. That's why it seemed like Oklahoma had a really favorable schedule, and a schedule that was going to set them up to make the Big 12 championship. But we didn't realize that Baylor and Oklahoma State were going to be so good, and it wound up being a tough schedule in the conference because they had to play both Baylor and Oklahoma State on the road. You have to wonder, what if just one of those games had been flipped? What if they had played Baylor or Oklahoma State at home? Would the Sooners perhaps have made it to the Big 12 championship? Well, let's look at 2022 here. First, we start with those non-conference games. So they'll play UTEP, Kent State, and on the road at Nebraska. Those are the 3 non-conference games. That Nebraska game is going to be tough. It's on the road. Nebraska is going to be a pretty good team. Again, they were much better than their record would suggest last season. Who do they play home? Who do they play away? They play TCU on the road. They play Iowa State on the road. They play West Virginia on the road. And they play Texas Tech on the road. That's pretty favorable, at least with what we think is the big picture in the Big 12. We think that Baylor and Iowa State are going, not Iowa State, Oklahoma State, I should say, we think that those are going to be the 2 teams that are near the top of the Big 12, along with maybe Oklahoma, maybe Texas. But you get both of those games at home this year. So while Oklahoma had to play Baylor and Oklahoma State on the road last year, they'll get them at home this year. And I think that sets up really, really well for the Sooners. So they start with UTEP, they play Kent State, then they play Nebraska. So their 3 non-conference games are those first 3 weeks. Then they'll get Kansas State after that on September 24th at home. TCU on the road October 1st, and then the big game against Texas on October the 8th. So a good chance for this team to go 5-0. Nebraska will be tough. Not saying they'll win that game, but if they can beat Nebraska, I think there's a pretty good chance this team will start off 5-0. And then they'll get the game against Texas. If you win that, then you get Kansas, Iowa State with no Brock Purdy. Probably not going to be as tough this year. Big game against Baylor on November 5th, but it will be a home game. Follow that up with West Virginia, tough place to play on the road, November 12th. Back home against Oklahoma State on November 19th. And then they close out the year on the road at Texas Tech. So I think the way this sets up in the Big 12, you couldn't ask for much more than this. The only thing that I would maybe want to flip if I was an Oklahoma fan, I'd want to put Kansas on the road. Just go ahead and play that game on the road, and then maybe get a West Virginia or a Texas Tech at home. But other than that, I mean, the home and away really sets up well for them. I don't expect Iowa State to be quite as good this year. Kansas State's a tough place to play on the road. You get them at home. You get the 2 teams that went to the Big 12 championship at home last year with Baylor and Oklahoma State. So I think this schedule puts Oklahoma in a really good position to make it to the Big 12 championship. And then in the non-conference, it's going to be all about Nebraska. That game will really set the tone for the season. If they can win that game, like I said, good chance to be 5-0 going into that Texas game and working their way back up towards the top 10, or who knows, maybe even into college football playoff contention. So a really nice Big 12 schedule for Oklahoma coming up in 2022. Here are the projections from 2021, and you can see a 10-2 record for Oklahoma. Could have been worse than that, honestly. A lot of close games. It could have also been 12-0. I mean, they had chances to win the games that they lost, but it could have really gone either way. So 10-2, and that was the projection. So our projection was right on the money last year. Our projection had them at 10-2. Our prediction, though, I actually predicted this team to go 12-0. I didn't think they were going to lose a game. I thought they were going to win a playoff game as well. Obviously, that did not happen. I think a lot of hype from 2020, the way they finished the year, it wasn't just me. A lot of people were on the Oklahoma bandwagon, thought that this team could potentially make a serious run at a national championship. It just didn't happen. And again, they went 10-2. FBI projected this team to go 11.2 and 1.7. The over-under was also at 11. So our projection was actually more accurate than anything last year, more accurate than me in my personal prediction. So we'll see what the projection says here for 2022. Again, this is the schedule, and this is the scale that we'll be using. You've got your 50-50 games in white. Those are games where I think the spread's only going to be about 3 or 4 points or less. 20%, 80%, under 20%, over 80%. Those are the games where I think a team's going to be favored by 14-plus points. Almost not guaranteed wins, but would be very big surprises if a team lost a game like that. You've got your 20-29 and 71-80%. Those are games where I think the spread will be double digits, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that range. 30-39%, 61-70%. That's where I think the spread's going to be about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points, kind of in that range. So for Oklahoma, you've got a couple of easy wins. Actually, I think 3 easy wins. You've got UTEP, Kent State, and Kansas. Kansas is a conference game. Kansas showed a little signs of life last year. I get that, but a game's at home. It's at Oklahoma. Yeah, it's closer to 80% than it is to 100%, but I do still think this is a green game. Same thing with UTEP and Kent State. So 3 wins that you can pretty much guarantee for Oklahoma. Then we go to the next category. A lot of games in the purple. A lot of games where I think Oklahoma is going to be favored by about a touchdown. We're talking about Kansas State, TCU on the road, at Iowa State, at West Virginia, at Texas Tech. Again, these are games where Oklahoma will be favored. I think they'll be a clear favorite, but not necessarily a huge favorite. And the way I'm kind of looking at the Big 12 is I'm looking at Baylor, Oklahoma State, Oklahoma kind of in that top tier. Texas is kind of in between them and the rest of the conference just because of the talent that they have. And then you've got these other teams like Kansas State, TCU, Iowa State, West Virginia, Texas Tech. All teams that, could be decent this year. They could be pretty bad. It's hard to really say for sure about most of these teams. I don't think any of them are really considered contenders in the Big 12, but then again, I don't think a lot of people expected Baylor and Oklahoma State to be there last year, so who knows what's going to happen. And with Oklahoma, it's hard to project what this team is going to be with all the new faces, new coaching staff. Is this going to be a top 10 team? Possibly. Is this going to be a team that's not even in the top 25 or barely in the top 25? That's possible as well. Just a lot of question marks around Oklahoma, so it's hard to know really where to project them. But again, I'm putting them kind of in that category with Baylor and Oklahoma State in the Big 12. So the rest of the schedule here, I think these are 50-50 games. I think Nebraska, Texas, Baylor, Oklahoma State, all 50-50 games. Texas is basically always a 50-50 game. Oklahoma, I think it's going to be looked at as the better team coming into the season, but it's a rivalry game. It's always close, and Texas has talent, so I think that's a 50-50 game. Baylor and Oklahoma State, a couple of other 50-50 games. They are home games for Oklahoma, though, so that is really good news for them. If they can take care of business at home, win the games they're supposed to win, could be a really good year for Oklahoma. And then I've also got Nebraska up there as a 50-50 game. Nebraska was so close in so many games last year, including against Oklahoma. The game is on the road. I think there's enough there to where that is a 50-50 game, a game that could really go either way. So you've got 4 of those games. If they split those 4 games, go 2-2 in those 4 games, that would only be 2 losses. But the problem when we do this projection, at least if you're an Oklahoma fan, is you got to average all these games out. The green games are counted as wins, but then when you average out Kansas State, TCU, Iowa State, West Virginia, and Texas Tech, and you put those games at 65%, that would really tell you that Oklahoma is going to probably go 3-2 in those games. They're not a big enough favorite to where they're going to go 4-1 or 5-0. So the projection, when you average everything out, does come out to be 8-4. I think 8-4 is kind of the benchmark for Oklahoma. If you go better than 8-4 in Brent Venables' first year, I think that's a good season. I think 9-3 is a good year for Oklahoma this year with all the question marks. But at the same time, they can win really every game on their schedule. So if you look at it like that, maybe you're thinking, oh, this team needs to go 10-2 or 11-1. But if they're less than 8-4, if they're 7-5, I think that is a disappointing year for Oklahoma. But the projection, again, 8-4 when you average everything out. Our projection was 10-2 last year, right on the mark. We'll see if it comes out to be accurate this year at 8-4. Do you guys agree? Do you disagree? What is your projection for Oklahoma coming up in 2022?